Number 1. Videotape. This happened back in the late 1980s. That was before places like Blockbuster Video really hit it big, and there were tons of mom and pop video stores. I know it seems weird to say that since now Blockbuster has gone the way of those stores too. It makes it seem like it was a lot longer time ago than it was. I always remember the "Be kind, please rewind" stickers that stores put on their videotapes. But I don't think everyone really paid attention. There were plenty of times that I rented a tape and it was not rewound. There was a time or two that I got a tape that was not even the right tape. So again, I didn't think the people at the store really paid the kind of attention to what they were doing that they wanted you to think that they were. This one weekend when I was in high school, a buddy of mine and I decided to rent some movies. It was Friday night, and that was the usual night that we would watch scary movies. So I rented a few, and spent the evening watching them. When it came to the last movie, I noticed that there was something really strange about the tape. It didn't have any sort of label on it. It was supposed to be an anthology horror movie called Dead Time Stories. It was a movie I had seen multiple times myself, but my buddy had never seen it. We put the tape into play. I immediately could tell that it was not Dead Time Stories, however. It was obviously something that was taped on a camcorder, and it started out showing a living room couch. So it was a good assumption that the camcorder was sitting on a coffee table in front of the couch. I told my friend that I had no idea what was going on, and that this was definitely not the movie that I had seen before. But that didn't matter at the time. We were both just curious as to what we had actually gotten on that tape. For quite a few moments nothing happened, and then there was some guy walking up behind the couch. By the way the camera was sitting, you couldn't see the upper third of his body at first though. It wasn't until he walked around the couch and then finally sat down on the couch that we could see his head. Well, we could sort of see his head, is what I mean to say. He was wearing some strange greenish color monster mask. It was that color that back then you could tell that it was a glow-in-the-dark mask. And when he reached over and turned off the lamp that was on his end table, the room went dark. But you could still sort of see him a little. The mask, on the other hand, was completely visible, of course. It was glowing brightly in the dark. And then the guy began telling a story. He was telling how he had these problems and weird thoughts growing up. And his weird thoughts were just about liking scary things and things that happen in the dark. And he also really enjoyed killing insects and spiders whenever he saw them. The man on the tape told us how he grew older, and he became more interested in maybe tormenting bigger things. He went into a little detail about that, which I am not going to get into. It was because it was animals, and I don't really like writing about hurting animals. But it was something that the man in the glowing mask said that he did, and then he said that he had an admission to make. He wanted to get it off his chest, but he also didn't want to get arrested for it. That is why he was wearing the glow-in-the-dark mask. He told us that he wanted to kill someone. He had thought long and hard about it, and then began hanging out on this college campus really late at night, trying to pick out a person to kill. He said that he waited and waited, patient enough to find the right person. We were both totally creeped out by this little film, although I have to admit, we honestly didn't believe it at first. I mean, it was doubtful somebody would actually confess to something like this on a videotape. We both assumed it was a hoax. He talked about this girl he saw on campus and followed her around a bit, and he told us how he got to know her, and after taking her out a few times, invited her over to his place. He told us that they had hit it off pretty well, but little did she know that she was his intended victim. So we waited for the guy to tell us more of the story, but instead he just paused for a while, looking at the camera, and then he said, and that night was tonight. The guy got up but didn't yet turn any light on. We heard some noises of a ripping sound, and then a few thumping sounds followed by a horrid, blood-curdling scream. And then the video ended, and then went to static. There was nothing further on the tape, even though it was obviously a very long tape. I was unnerved by it. My friend, on the other hand, just still thought it was a cheap hoax, meant to try and scare someone. He explained to me that no one would do something that stupid. The only thing the video store would have to do is check the people who rented dead time stories, and they would be able to find the person if it had been a real kidnapping. Like, that made sense, and I decided it had to be fake. But that doesn't mean I haven't thought about it every now and then over the years. And even if it was fake, it was still a really demented thing to do. Number 2. Drive. I grew up in a very rural area. My parents weren't rich or anything, but we had a fairly decent life. This was in the 70s, so things were a lot different than they are nowadays. It was more common back then to see someone driving down a country road with an open beer between their legs. Although I don't live out in the country now, nor have I in a very long time, I like to think that things like that don't really happen anymore. I learned to drive when I was about 12 years old. That was not unusual for me or my family, and it wasn't too strange for one of us to take the car out and go somewhere. I had a lot of friends my age who chewed tobacco at a really young age too. I tried it a few times, however, and I really didn't care for it. I was good friends for a while with a guy named Vance. We had grown up in the same general area, up on the ridge. Our houses weren't really that close together, but we rode the same school bus to school. We were friends from kindergarten until sometime in high school. The reason the two of us stopped being friends in high school was due to a girl that he liked for years, liking me even more than him. Although I wasn't interested in her, and never would have dated someone that my friend liked, this still made him angry, and after a while he simply stopped hanging out with me. And a while after that, he became very antagonistic with me, which was a pretty horrible thing because no one wants to lose a friend to a situation like that. When I was 17, I was home by myself on a weekend night. I decided to take one of the old cars and see a different buddy of mine who lived further up the ridge than I did. It was about an hour's drive to his house. Since it was a dark dirt road the entire time, you had to be careful on some of those roads because they were on the sides of hills, and there was not anything like a guardrail to keep you from driving off the side of the road. When I left his house to go home, it was pretty late. I went outside, and it was actually a little foggy out. It was not ideal to drive out in that weather, but it just meant that I would have to take my time and be more careful driving. It wasn't too long after I was driving that I noticed some lights behind me. Another vehicle was behind me. The road wasn't really wide enough for more than a car and a half, so he couldn't pass me. But he kept driving up to me really fast. In fact, before he slowed down, I almost thought he was going to hit me. He had gotten really close to hitting me, but then he backed off just a bit. When he was about a car's length behind me, however, he flashed his high beams on, and then he sped up, just enough to almost hit me again. But right before he hit me, he slowed down again. However, he kept his high beams on, which made it very difficult for me to see. I tried pulling my car over, so it would be a little bit off the side of the road. This is what you would do if you wanted to let a car go on the opposite way go by you, or if you wanted to let someone pass you. I was trying to let the guy pass me, assuming that was what he wanted. The guy made no attempt to pass me, however. He just did the exact thing over and over again. He pulled up really close to me, and then backed off again. However, this time, he began honking his horn at me. I began to get very nervous. Every time this guy repeated this pattern, I got even more scared, and he began honking his horn even more and more. I tried speeding up, which I was hesitant to do. I didn't like driving fast on those roads, even when there wasn't any fog, but that didn't change anything. When I sped up, he sped up too, and he kept getting close as if he was going to hit me, right before backing off yet again. He did this over and over and over, while still honking his horn at me. After I don't know how long this kept up, we had gotten to the bottom of the hill, but we were still in a highly forested area. But thankfully by that point I wasn't very far from home. I thought I could make it there, and at least I knew my family would be home by then, and if this guy followed me, my brothers would help me beat the crap out of him. No sooner than that thought was in my head, however, the car did its pattern again, but this time it hit me. I reacted by hitting the brakes, which caused my car to spin and to skid off the road. The only thing that I remember after that was nothing. I woke up in the hospital. This was 3 months after the accident. My car had rammed right into a big tree. I wasn't wearing a seatbelt because I never did. The only thing that probably kept me from flying through the windshield was the big steering wheel that my head and chest bounced off of. I had some bad head injuries and I'd been out for almost a month. I guess I'd opened my eyes after a month, but wasn't acting like myself. It's like they told me that I was aware, but not completely back to myself yet. I don't really remember correctly because it was so many decades ago, but I had a violent and sort of feral behavior that required me to even be restrained for a while. And then one day, the day that I felt like I woke up, was actually 2 months after I had opened my eyes. I never found out exactly who was driving that car that rammed me. However, some people who knew me in high school later told me that Vance had been bragging that it was him after it had happened. Vance's dad worked in the police department, and thus there was never an investigation to see if he had done it. That, of course, convinced me that, yes, he had. I don't really live out in the country anymore, but I really hope it's harder for crooked people to get away with things like that now. Number 3. Noises. The best advice that I can give anyone about meeting people over the internet is to always meet them in a neutral place. Try and get a good read on them before you go over to their place or invite them over to your place, because you never know what might happen if you don't do this. I'm a little older, and I was dating age back when the internet started becoming a thing. I had a hard time dating before that. I have to admit that I used dating lines a lot when I was younger, and even got addicted to them. I spent a lot of money on those lines. I did meet a lot of people in the city, although nothing really worked out. There was a saying, people who use the dating lines are just the people who strike out at the bars. Well, I was too young to go to the bars, so I'm not really sure that applied to me. The internet came around and things changed a lot. It became a lot easier and cheaper to meet people, so that was a cool thing. I am Canadian. I don't want to tell you exactly where I lived, but we had really cold and snowy winters. And the winter that this story takes place in was really cold. We had a lot of snowstorms, and I spent a lot of time home by myself in the cold. If you have been in an area like this, you understand what I mean. But for the most part, I always met people at a neutral place, and I never ran into anyone who was abusive or anything like that. This one time, years later, that I did something like that, I made a big and scary mistake. Now, I didn't actually meet this guy at his place the first time. We actually met outside my apartment, and we went to a movie. After that, we sat in his car for a while, and we talked while the snow was falling outside. It was a nice visit, and I felt like we had a very nice connection because we talked for so long. A few days later, I was hanging out online. And this guy, his name was Mark, asked me if I wanted to come over to his place. We were still getting snow, so I wasn't particularly keen on driving, but he talked me into it. Mark had a really nice house. It was really big and looked really old, but was in really good condition. I could tell that he likely had a lot of money. The house was also outside town, and it was down a pretty lonely road. Anyway, I parked in his driveway and then walked up to his house. Knocking on the door, he answered it and seemed really happy to see me. He brought me in, immediately offering me a drink. I accepted. But as you can probably tell from the previous things that I have said, I'm a bit cautious about things. I followed him and watched him as he made the drink. I've always done this with people because I've always been afraid someone would slip something into my drink. We sat down in his really nice living room to watch a movie. I don't recall what it was. I think it was mostly because we were talking a lot through it all. As I was talking to him, though, I started to hear some weird noises in his house. It sounded like there was another person in the house, moving around in his basement. I asked him if he had a roommate or something, and he said no. He told me that he did have a cat, though, and the cat was probably in the basement. Throughout the night, he got me a few more drinks. I went with him each time that he went to get them. He told me a few times that I didn't have to do that, and I told him that I really didn't like to have breaks in the conversation. But really, like before, I just didn't like the idea of someone making my drinks when I couldn't watch them doing it. Each time we went back to the living room, though, I kept hearing more noises and movements in his basement, and it didn't really sound like it was a cat that was moving around down there. I mean, the sounds seemed localized in one place, and if I didn't know better, it sounded like someone or something was struggling down there. Although I was unnerved a little by what I was hearing, I tried not to think about it too much. I mean, my imagination very often ran away with me. But still, the whole thing was so weird that it kept really bothering me. Of course, I eventually convinced myself that I was being paranoid. I did have quite a history of it. Later in the night, though, something happened that I didn't expect to hear with my paranoia. I mean, it gives me chills to even think of it to this day. The noises had continued going on for quite a while, and Mark, who seemed to be brushing them off for the most part, began to look like he was getting annoyed, and eventually he got up to excuse himself. He told me he had to go check on something. Not long after, I heard Mark yelling in the basement. He was saying things like, "Stop making so much damn noise," and "I have someone upstairs trying to enjoy a movie." And he sounded mad and even a little crazy. However, the noises got a little louder, and he kept yelling and screaming at whomever or whatever was making the noises. I was too weirded out at that point. I had my car keys in my pocket, so while he was yelling, I slipped out the front door. The whole night had been so uneasy and uncomfortable, and I just couldn't sit around after what I was hearing going on in that basement. So I got into my car, started it, and began backing quickly as I could down the long driveway. About halfway down the driveway, I noticed the porch lights to the house come on. I also saw Mark come out on the front porch, but he just stood there watching as I drove backward and off the driveway. When I got to the end of it, I turned and drove off as fast as I could. I didn't know what was going on in that house, and I didn't want to know. It was just way too weird for me. Mark didn't try to contact me at all after that. I guess he probably knew if I left while he was downstairs, I didn't want anything to do with him. I don't know his reasoning, but I'm glad that he never did.
Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.